Welcome, listeners, to this special series from Advanced TV Herstory. It's a collaborative effort with The Real Women and its fearless leader, Ashley Pacini.
The Real Women is a networking platform that celebrates the successes of women in filmed entertainment. Each week, we profile a different woman who we can support. There are plenty of women ready and willing to take that next step in their careers, and we're here to help them get there.
You know, frankly, Advanced TV Herstory is all about supporting women in entertainment, as well as bringing you the stories of these women that help you in your everyday life. Now, of late, we at Advanced TV Herstory have focused our position and our voice on connecting the dots of TV and feminism to politics and culture, because that is something we all have in common. It's just that many of us also have that perspective, watching TV and having an even more powerful experience. Listeners, this all happens behind the camera as well as in front of it, the stories that are being told.
We hope you enjoyed this chat with one of our real women. I'm super excited to introduce Pepper Reed. Pepper,
Hello.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to have you on because I think you'll have some really unique perspectives because you've lived in LA a couple different times and you've had experience with the industry kind of in two different time periods. And so I think you'll bring a lot of insights into the current industry and also the changes that you've seen happen in the industry during the time that you moved home and then back. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But first I wanted to start with asking you started in the industry as an actor, then you became a script supervisor, and now you're a writer, director. How did your acting and script supervising inform your directing and writing, and how did that journey take place?
It was really convoluted.
Sure.
First of all, I was always a writer. I wouldn't have necessarily called myself that, but from a very young age, I was creating stories in my head. My dad built me this great playhouse that looked like a castle, and I would create these stories, decorate them, put on costumes, and act the stories out from like very, very young. So I was always a writer, but I didn't know that that was like a job.
Because you were creating stories essentially with this,
right.
This playhouse and yeah.
Yes. So I was totally creating stories about witches and princesses and maidens and damsels and knights and all different kinds of things. And I was creating those. But at 3, you can't write them down.
Right.
I mean, I could read at 3, but I couldn't quite write yet.
Right.
But I started acting very young. I think my first play was when I was about 3, and then I did children's theater all the way up into high school. And I knew professional actors. The directors of the children's theater that I worked in were also professional equity actors. They would go on tour. They made their living as actors.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, like that was a job that really existed.
Right.
I didn't know any writers. I didn't
Right.
know anyone who wrote for film or television or theater. I didn't know like that was, I mean, as a kid and I'm in Oklahoma, which as great theater education as I got because my parents put me in these children's theater companies. At school, that's not super encouraged. There's not a ton of money going to the theater department, arts in general. So I went with being an actor because that seemed like something that could be done. Because I knew people who did it, it was a real job. Whereas like it didn't even occur to me that being a writer could really be a job.
Right. It was visible. You could see that there were people doing this job and actually getting paid for it. I mean, the assumption is if you see somebody doing it, right, they're getting paid for it or to some degree, it's a career and able to support them.
Right. And I decided really young, like where I was going to go to college. I went to NYU. I was in Tisch. I was in Playwrights Horizons, theater school. That was my studio. But like I decided that at 13 that I was going to go to NYU. And so once I was on that track, like that was what I was doing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I put a lot of energy towards doing that, but I still was writing. I wrote my first short play. I think I was 16. I wrote my first really, really, really bad screenplay because I'd never actually seen a screenplay. I was just kind of making up how it would look in my head. I wrote that with a friend of mine when we were 18 or 19. My friend and I were going to perform in it. Like we were going to act in it. We were writing this thing for us to act in.
Is that because even actors today, you know, that I'm familiar with, they do a lot of writing and producing to act. Was this one of those instances where you were writing to act or were you acting to write?
I would say at the time I was writing to act.
Mm-hmm.
I know my friend was also doing that. Like we were writing it together and we were writing it. Not that we had any idea how to actually produce a film. We hadn't even finished college yet when we started writing that. So it was just writing a thing that we thought somehow magically we could make happen.
Sure. So you do acting and you're at NYU and then you make the move to LA to act full time.
I did.
Did you move because that's what you do? You move to LA to make it. Is that what the mentality was?
Yes. I moved to Los Angeles to try and make it as an actor. Yes. But I was also working full time. So I ended up doing much more theater than I did get to audition for film and television. So I ended up doing theater in LA more than I think I was in very few film or television projects because I had these full-time day jobs.
And theaters at night.
So theaters at night, I could go to work and then I'd leave work and go to rehearsal or go to whatever performance I was in. So I did that. I ended up working in a casting office for a year, which was incredibly eye-opening.
Really? In what way?
Yes. How it really wasn't about talent. Because you could see amazing performances. I was recording producer sessions and in between the sessions, you'd hear the director and possibly the showrunner or one of the other writers, one of the other producers sitting in the room. And, we can't hire her because she's blonde. And the scene happens with the lead of the show and the lead of the show is already blonde and we can't have two blondes.
Right.
Or, and that's like visually, it's not as appealing to have two people who look very similar. I get the mindset having taken film classes now on like directing and cinematography and that sort of thing. But it became very apparent that it wasn't necessarily about your talent and that your job as an actor was not to act. Your job as an actor is to audition, which are two totally different skill sets. Like rehearsing and going through the process of creating a character for a play and performing in that play every night is one thing, but having 20 minutes with a cold script to create a character and just go in and perform at an audition is something totally different. It's a skill set that I realized that I didn't really have and wasn't necessarily sure I wanted to develop.
Right. Because at this point, did you know were you leaning more towards writing at this point or?
I was writing a lot more already.
Okay.
I had written a short film, though I had no idea how to actually get that made yet. I was working on writing a feature and was working with a co-writer who did have an idea on how things got shot, which I didn't at the time. So I felt like there was more possibilities in that process. I ended up going on a tour for a production not long after that. And at that point, I was just really kind of done with LA. And I had a whole bunch of family stuff happening back home. So I ended up moving back to Oklahoma.
Okay.
And that's where I became a script supervisor.
Okay. So going to script supervising and for listeners that might not know what a script supervisor does, give us like a really quick understanding of what that is. And then, your experience as a script supervisor. And then obviously, ultimately, how it's led you to writing.
So when I moved home, we were about halfway done through with the first draft of that feature that I was writing. We ended up doing several drafts. He was still in Los Angeles and we would work on the phone. I was trying to decide if I should go to grad school for film because I honestly had no real concept. I mean, I'd been on set, I'd seen, that there were different departments and like I got things because I can understand logically when they roll credits and there's thousands of names.
Right.
Like that there were lots of different departments and different people doing different jobs, but I really wasn't sure how I could get involved with that. So I was like, should I go to grad school? I had a conversation with my dad about it and he was like, we spent $120,000 for you to go to NYU. I was like, yes, we did. He's like, are all of the other really good film schools about that much money? And I was like, yeah, they probably are. He's like, let's make sure you actually want to go back to school before we start spending that money. So Oklahoma City Community College has a really good film and television production department.
Okay.
which sounds crazy. They have a wonderful soundstage. When I went, they had some of the like most high-tech equipment available in Oklahoma. They were a really great program. I took 2 cinematography classes. I took an editing class. I took a directing class over a year and just was learning about the film industry and learning about the film industry in Oklahoma, which does exist. Some incredibly talented people work in these small local markets.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my professors was like, you would be a really good script supervisor. I had no idea what that was, but I'm shooting a feature. Would you like to come shadow our script supervisor? And I said, of course I would.
Right.
So I did some research into what a script supervisor is. Their job is to be, especially for film, the writer's almost never on set.
Mm-hmm.
So a script supervisor is the voice of the writer and the voice of the editor on set.
Okay.
I sit with the director while we're shooting. And, you know, if continuity doesn't match, if someone's hair goes from being in a ponytail to being down between setups,
Mm-hmm.
or if someone's purse is on the wrong arm, or a glass goes from being full to being empty, I'm watching for all of those things. I'm making notes about the actual shots that are being done, the different setups that the camera does, the different takes that the director likes. If an actor ad-libs a line and it's hilarious and everybody loves it and it's great, but it changes the story because they're commenting on a scene that happens later in the film, but they technically don't know that item at the time, I make sure that we get another take that it's got it clean.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how great that ad lib might be, it could change the whole storyline of the film. That's something you got to pay attention to. That's a script supervisor. I take continuity photos throughout the day and just making sure that things will hopefully go smoothly in the edit for the editor. And I make all those notes that go to the editor.
And so you start doing script supervising. You're in Oklahoma still.
Yes.
And so what about you then at some point moved back to LA?
So I moved back because I'd made the decision that I wanted to write TV.
Okay.
And that was a change because I'd been writing features. I'd written 4 features at that point. And I was looking at my goals of what I wanted to do in the future. And there was one specific piece of IP that I just wanted to be involved with.
And IP, you mean?
Intellectual property, a book, graphic novel. It could be an article in a newspaper or a magazine. It's something that's already in existence. And I really wanted to help that piece of IP become a TV show.
Mm-hmm.
It had been in development hell for 20 years at that point. They'd been trying to make it into a movie over and over and over again. And like you'd hear announcements about it. And then you'd hear 6 months later that it wasn't going to happen.
Right.
Because for whatever reason, it had fallen apart. I love this piece of IP. I still to this day love this piece of IP. I wanted to be involved with it, but I knew it couldn't be a film. It needed to be a TV show. And I realized if I wanted to work on this piece of IP as a TV show, then I needed to have experience in television.
Yeah.
So with that as my goal to work on this specific project, I realized, okay, what do I need to do to get to there? I had just transitioned from writing dramas to, I'd written my first genre feature. By genre, I mean sci-fi, fantasy, horror. And I was like, that's a good place to start because the IP was genre. It's a fantasy piece. So I knew, okay, if I start here and I keep focusing on genre and I start looking into how to write television because it is different than writing a feature, I started moving in that direction. I was listening to this wonderful podcast that I love called Happier in Hollywood, which is hosted by these 2 showrunners, Liz Craft and Sarah Fain. And they were talking about how to become a TV writer. And they said, if you want to write TV, you have to live in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, crap.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I wanted to write features, like you can technically live anywhere and write features.
Right.
But writers' rooms, they're almost all in Los Angeles. That's where the writers' rooms are. And I realized I have to move back.
Right.
So about 6 months later, I did.
There you go. And you've been in LA now for what, 2-3 years?
2.5 years. My anniversary is in February. So August is my 6-month anniversary.
And I actually met you officially when you moved to LA. We had been in contact a little bit because I had profiled you on The Real Women. I was introduced to you through a
mutual friend.
Through a mutual friend. And so you had actually reached out to me when you moved to LA, and we ended up getting coffee or lunch or something, and
we got gelato.
We did get gelato. You're right. That's right. We got gelato.
Yeah.
That was the first time we met. And since then, we've just kind of stayed in contact because I'm very much a fan of your passion and drive. And I think that you have a lot to share, and a lot of people can gain a lot from you, especially, you know, picking up and moving across the country again. I wanted to actually ask you a little bit more about this IP, for example, and you leaning towards genre, because even when you were little, as you were sharing your story of this playhouse, and you were creating stories with witches and handmaidens, and you know, that's essentially genre, right?
Right.
And so why is it about genre pieces in particular do you gravitate towards?
I think genre is great for misfits. I was an only child until I was 9, and I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't really fit in. I was a bit of a misfit. Mm-hmm. I say that while I was trying to cast spells, the other girls were doing cartwheels. Mm-hmm. We were just at two opposite ends of the spectrum. And I've found that writing fantasy is actually helpful to let people, I don't want to say normal people, but like people who don't have those kinds of issues. The average viewer, they're able to connect with creatures, you know, werewolves and vampires, when they couldn't connect to someone who is similar, but just an ordinary human. Mm-hmm. I think it's because the viewers are already expecting the creature to be different from them, that any additional differences aren't that big of a deal. And then when they start to like see themselves in the characters, because, you know, like the werewolf just wants to be loved, or the vampire is looking for a family, then they can connect on an additional level, which I just think is beautiful. Mm-hmm. So I've been reading genre, lots of fantasy, supernatural, some sci-fi since I was pretty young. It's just always been something that I've loved, and I've kind of come full circle in that. I tried writing other things and just realized that that wasn't where I was supposed to be. I was supposed to be writing genre.
Mm-hmm. It's great. And I think that is one thing that's powerful when it comes to genre pieces, is even though it is characters from out of this world, there is an element that you can identify with these characters. I think that's really powerful. Even average people can identify, even if they don't consider themselves a misfit, or they're not the misfit. That's the power of these characters. And I think that's what you're tapping into, is how powerful these stories are. And I think that's beautiful.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah. So I've known you now for 2.5 years personally, but I've always known you through emails and that before, as we were going back and forth. You are Pepper with purple hair. And I love this aspect. You've kind of branded yourself Pepper with purple hair. And I'm curious the story behind that, and if it was intentional or not. And do you feel like it's benefited you as a person and your identity?
I started wanting purple hair when I was about 16. There was this guy I liked who I ended up later dating who had purple hair, and I just loved his hair. I loved it. But I was acting, and I did mostly musical theater, especially in high school and college. So most musicals don't have characters with purple hair.
Right.
And a lot of the theaters that I was working in didn't have the money to buy wigs, so that wasn't an option. So when I finally stopped acting, when I had moved back to Oklahoma, I was like, I'm 1, a grown-up, and 2, I'm not acting anymore, so I don't have any excuse to not do this thing that I've wanted to do since I was, 16. It's just hair.
Right.
You can cut it all off. You can dye it a different color. So I did my hair purple. It'll be 10 years in October. I'll have had purple hair for 10 years.
Wow.
I loved having purple hair. It feels so true to who I am. Mm-hmm. Even before I had purple hair, I would say I was the purple sheep of my family.
Oh, interesting.
Because I was just so different from everybody else. But Pepper with the purple hair, as a phrase, as like a brand, came about because of Happier in Hollywood.
Oh, interesting.
I was like an early listener of the podcast, and I became a frequent poster on their Facebook group. And when they had their first meetup, I planned my trip to come out to LA to look at apartments.
Right. So this is before you officially moved back to LA the second time. Yeah.
Yes, I was still living in Oklahoma, but they had planned a mixer. I needed to come out and look at apartments. I'm going to make sure I'm there for that Saturday so I can go to this event and start meeting some people. And because I had posted on the Facebook group so much, I had said, hey, everybody, I don't know anyone at this mixer. I'm coming in from Oklahoma. Please say hi to me.
Right.
I arrived at the same time as Liz Craft and Sarah Fain, the hosts.
Mm-hmm.
And Liz saw me walking up to the building and she said, hey, it's Pepper with the purple hair.
Look at that.
I ended up being a guest later on the show and she called me that on air. And so now when I go to events, especially writer events in LA, anybody who listens to the podcast knows me as Pepper with the purple hair because Liz called me that on air.
Right.
So that's how that came about.
That's amazing. No, I love it. No, and I think it's a defining element of your personality now, and it helped define you as a professional, frankly. I know your purple hair doesn't affect your writing, but it does influence people remembering you.
Yes, that's definitely true.
So here we are, Pepper with purple hair.
Yes.
You started out as an actor, script supervisor. Now you're a writer. You write genre for television. You're back in LA. You've had a lot of awesome experiences. How have all of these experiences made you a better writer and made you unique to be able to write genre and to be able to take this next step in your career?
Because I have lived so many places. I have moved cross country so many times. There's also some time lived in Portland, Oregon, and some time lived in Paris, France, in addition to New York and Los Angeles.
Right.
I've lived in a lot of different places and diverse places. I say the smartest thing I ever did was living in Paris in college, a semester abroad. When you live in another country, you are forced to look at things in a different way because you're not the majority.
Right.
You have to look at things in a different way. You have to change your perspective of things. It opens your eyes in ways that I don't think anything else can do in the same way. Every writer has different experiences. That's what's so beautiful about TV writing, especially, is because you have a room full of people blending their experiences and their different stories together to create a show.
Mm-hmm.
Writers' rooms with people who have lived in places that I've never lived in, who have different lives, who are married and have kids, or hundreds and thousands of different things. They make stories more rounded. They make stories deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so important and so beautiful. I don't want to read two-dimensional characters. I don't want to watch two-dimensional characters. I want to watch people who have heart, who have depth to them, who have reasons for why they're doing the thing that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they're not the reasons why I would do something. And maybe I wouldn't do what they're doing, but I want to be able to at least understand where someone else is coming from. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about a writer's room.
Mm-hmm. So Pepper, you've talked about this piece of IP, this story that you resonate with and which ultimately changed your life in that one, it helped you growing up and as you were a participant in this world that was created, but also it helped you in your decision to move to LA. So my final question, if you're in the room with the producers and the showrunners and they say to you, why are you the best person to be a part of this writing team? Why should I choose you?
Well, the piece of IP is the series of graphic novels called Sandman. They're by Neil Gaiman, and they're amazing. If you haven't read them, you should. I'm really connected with some very specific characters that are in that series. I think both Death and Delirium, who are two of the Endless, are two of my favorite characters in literature. I think I understand them on a really deep level, and working to create those characters as, living, breathing things is just something that I think I can do in a way that other people wouldn't necessarily be able to do just because of how much I get them.
Mm-hmm.
It's an amazing world that Sandman takes place in. I'm really good at building worlds. And I have some really cool ideas for how to visually create those worlds. a lot of the story takes place in what's called the dreaming, which is where humans go when they dream, where your consciousness goes when you dream. And I have some really interesting ideas that I think they would enjoy. That Neil Gaiman, who's the creator of the show, and he's helping to write the scripts, and Alan Heinberg, who's the screenwriter. He was the screenwriter for Wonder Woman, but he's the showrunner, and they're both amazing, amazing writers. Because I've been a script supervisor, one of the things I know I'm good at is finding plot holes. Even when you're coming from a piece of IP, because you're having to do that translation, there are things that get overlooked. There are pieces of the puzzle that end up being missing. And because one, I know the IP really well, and two, because I've got a different kind of eye to look at things, I'm really good at finding those early on and can hopefully help come up with ideas to correct that, to fix those holes so that they're not missing from the story.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And so for listeners, if anybody has a connection to Neil Gaiman or the production that is doing Sandman, please pass on Pepper's information. Pass on this episode. Share this episode. It'd go a long way. Go a long way for sure. Well, Pepper, thank you so much for your time and for joining and for being an amazing real woman and for sharing your example with the community.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
Whether you're interested in writing for TV and film or simply curious about how one launches a career in entertainment writing, it's safe to say that Pepper Reed and this interview has shown us that tenacity, creativity, and willingness to take a risk has and will serve her well. Take a cue from Pepper Reed. Pepper's interview rounds out this series with up-and-coming talent that we've done in collaboration with Ashley Pacini of The Real Women. Thanks so much, Ashley, for your work on this interview and on fielding an impressive group of women. Now, you may know that the final episode in this series is when Ashley and I speak with Margaret Cho. And let me say, it is essential listening. I know that you know that Margaret Cho is an established stand-up comedian, but perhaps you don't know that she wrote TV history in 1995 with her series All American Girl. She led an all-Asian American cast for the first ever sitcom about an Asian American family, centered on Cho's character. So don't miss this special episode where Margaret discusses some of the experiences of that series, as well as how far she thinks TV has come, and what white people who want to be part of the change can and should do to represent equity and the diverse experience that we know American life to be today. Margaret Cho is welcome on this podcast anytime, as are Ashley Pacini and her Real Women. Thanks, Ashley, and your community of The Real Women for all of the collaboration and support you've given this series. Thank you to Catherine Yang and the fine tune of Jazzer's Take Me Higher. So much a hallmark of advanced TV history. We are here to bring these stories to you, loyal listeners, and that's why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Demas Abrams.